She crossed half a country for a man who never showed up. Eleanor Hayes stepped off that train in Black Ridge, Montana, with $31, one battered trunk, and a stack of letters she had read so many times the ink had begun to fade at the folds. The platform was empty. The wind off the mountains hit her like a flat hand across the face, and somewhere between the last letter Caleb Mercer had ever written her and this precise, terrible moment, she understood that love letters and love itself were two entirely different things. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Eleanor Hayes noticed about the train was that it smelled like coal smoke and other people's ambitions. She had been sitting in the same seat for going on 37 hours, window side, second car from the rear, a position she had claimed with quiet determination the moment she boarded in Boston because she wanted to watch America change. She had never been west of the Connecticut River before. She was 23 years old, and she had never been anywhere that mattered, if she was being honest with herself, which she had been trying to do more of lately. It was October of 1887, and the country outside her window looked nothing like the country she had left behind. Boston had its own kind of beauty: red brick and iron lampposts, the smell of the harbor, cobblestones worn smooth by 100 years of foot traffic. There was a density to it, a sense of being surrounded and held in by something older than yourself. Eleanor had grown up inside that density, had let it press against her without really understanding that it was pressing. Her father's pharmacy on Tremont Street, her bedroom with its single north-facing window, the small, reliable circle of her days, which had felt, for the longest time, like enough. Then the letters started coming. The first one arrived in February, forwarded through her cousin Margaret in Billings, who had apparently mentioned Eleanor to half of Montana. Margaret was the kind of woman who collected people the way some women collected teacups, enthusiastically and without much consideration for whether the pieces would actually fit together. Eleanor had not asked to be collected, but the letter arrived anyway, in an envelope slightly battered from its travels, and inside was the careful handwriting of a man named Caleb Mercer. "Miss Hayes," he had written, "I hope you will forgive a stranger for writing to you directly. Your cousin has spoken of you with great affection, and I confess I have been persuaded by her description to try my luck. I'm a rancher outside of Black Ridge, 40 acres, good timber, a house that needs a woman's attention, and if I'm honest, so does the man who lives in it. I don't have much talent for flowery speech, but I have steady work and steady hands, and I intend to be a steady sort of man. If you would consent to correspond, I would consider it an honor." She had almost thrown it away. She could not remember exactly why she hadn't. Her life at that point was not unhappy in any dramatic way. She helped her father at the pharmacy, tallied accounts, kept things in order. She read voraciously, novels mostly, which her father tolerated with mild disapproval, and newspapers, which he approved of, and occasionally the agricultural almanac, which she found genuinely interesting in a way she could not explain to anyone without sounding peculiar. She had been briefly engaged to a man named Thomas Whitfield, a banker's son, and when that ended, badly, quietly, with a kind of mutual relief dressed up as heartbreak, she had absorbed herself in the ordinary business of getting on with things. But the letter stayed on her desk for 3 days, and on the 4th day she wrote back, "Mr. Mercer, I appreciate plain speech and have no use for flattery. I am 22 years old, in good health, educated through the Holyoke Female Seminary, and I am capable of hard work, though I suspect we define that term differently depending on our circumstances. I have enclosed a small photograph. If you find yourself still interested, I am willing to continue this correspondence." He wrote back within 2 weeks. The photograph he sent showed a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something unyielding. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, but there was a solidity to him that the camera had somehow captured. He stood in front of a fence line, squinting slightly at whoever was operating the camera, as though uncertain about the whole enterprise. She looked at that photograph for longer than she should have. Over the following months, the letters came with reliable frequency. Every 12 to 16 days, traveling the distance between Montana and Massachusetts with a consistency she found itself reassuring. He wrote about the ranch, about the cattle prices, and the trouble with fencing, and a particular horse named Bonaparte, who had strong opinions about working in the rain. He wrote about the town of Black Ridge, its general store and its single church, and the Hendersons who ran the hotel and thought rather too highly of themselves because of it. He did not write poetry. He did not make grand declarations. He wrote the way a person talks when they are not performing, and Eleanor found herself doing something she could not entirely explain. She began to trust the voice behind the words. Her father had concerns. He expressed them in the measured way he expressed everything, over dinner in mid-April, after Eleanor had mentioned Caleb's name 3 times in the span of an hour without noticing. "You haven't met this man," Arthur Hayes said, setting down his fork with the particular care of someone choosing their words simultaneously. "We've been corresponding for 2 months. Letters are not a meeting, Eleanor." "No," she agreed, "but they're a start." Her father looked at her the way he sometimes looked at prescriptions he wasn't sure about, with the particular attention of a man who understood that things that seem straightforward can turn complicated in the wrong conditions. He was 58, white-haired, careful in all his habits, and he loved Eleanor with the inarticulate intensity of a man who had watched her mother die when Eleanor was 12 and had spent the intervening years being quietly terrified of losing her too. What if he's not who he says he is? Eleanor reached across the table and touched his hand, just briefly. What if he is? The letters continued through the summer. In July, Caleb wrote that he had put a new window in the eastern bedroom. "The light in the morning is something," he wrote. "I thought you ought to know about it." She read that sentence 4 times. She wasn't sure if it was a promise exactly, but it felt like one. Like the shape of one, at least. Like a man pointing at something real and saying, "This is here, this could be yours." In August, he wrote something more direct. "Miss Hayes, I have been thinking about this for some time, and I am not a man who thinks without reaching a conclusion eventually. I would like you to come out to Blackridge. I would like to do this proper. Meeting your father, making an official arrangement, all of it the right way. But first I need to know if you would consider it. I know it's a long way, and I know it's a great deal to ask. I don't have much to offer, except honesty and the sincere intention to make a good life. I believe you could be part of that. I'd like the chance to show you so in person." She sat with that letter for a full day before she answered. When she wrote back, she said yes. The next 3 letters, September, early October, handled the logistics. He would meet her at the Blackridge station. He wrote the date in his firm, uncomplicated hand, October 14th, the 4:15 train from Billings. He would have someone put her up at the Henderson Hotel, he said, until they had a proper chance to see whether what they'd built in letters could survive the test of actual presence. He was careful about that, she thought. He wasn't assuming. He was asking. She respected that. She respected it enormously. She gave her father 3 weeks' notice. She arranged for her cousin Margaret to help transition the pharmacy accounts. She packed carefully, keeping to 2 trunks because she had read enough to know that whatever Montana was, it was not Boston, and there was a kind of stupidity in arriving weighted down by a life that wouldn't transfer. 1 trunk she left behind entirely, books, mostly, the ones she could replace, and 2 dresses she loved but knew were impractical, and she felt lighter for it. The morning she left, her father stood on the platform at South Station and held her for a moment longer than he usually permitted himself. He was not a demonstrative man. The hug was not easy for him. She could feel the awkwardness of it alongside the love of it, and both of those things made her throat tighten. "Write me when you arrive," he said. "I will. Write me before you arrive. Write me from the train." She laughed and kissed his cheek and boarded. The first day and a half were genuinely thrilling. The country changed around her with the particular drama of a place that had not arranged itself for anyone's comfort. The cities gave way to towns, and the towns gave way to smaller towns, and eventually those scattered out into something that barely qualified as human settlement at all, just distance and sky, and occasionally a building sitting in the middle of it all with the stubborn presence of something that hadn't given up. The other passengers in her car were a variety of people going somewhere. A family with 3 children traveling to meet a grandfather Eleanor gathered was dying. 2 men in suits who spoke very quietly to each other about something involving timber rights. An older woman, alone, who slept with her hat still on and woke periodically to eat crackers from a paper bag with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this journey many times and had stopped pretending it was pleasant. By the second morning, the mountains appeared. Eleanor had seen illustrations and photographs and read descriptions in more books than she could count, but none of that prepared her for the actual physical fact of them. The way they rose out of the plains without preamble, without transition, just suddenly there, enormous and permanent and utterly indifferent to how you felt about them. She pressed her forehead against the window glass and stared until her eyes watered. Whatever this is, she thought, it's real. She took out Caleb's letters and read them through again. All 14 of them, in order, which she had done 3 times during the journey already. She was not a sentimental person by nature. She didn't keep dried flowers or pressed leaves or any of the small relics women were supposed to collect as evidence that their lives had contained beauty. But she had kept these letters carefully in a leather portfolio her father had given her the Christmas before. She read his description of Blackridge. Small, honest, the kind of place where everybody knows what you had for breakfast, but at least they care. And she allowed herself, despite her better instincts, to picture it. She read the letter about Bonaparte the horse. She read the one about the eastern window. She folded them back into the portfolio with the care of someone who understands that what they are handling is not just paper. The train pulled into Billings in early afternoon where she transferred. The connection car was smaller, older, the interior smelling of animals and something she couldn't identify that she eventually decided was just time. The journey from Billings to Blackridge was supposed to take 2 hours and 40 minutes. She watched the remaining daylight carefully through the window. At 4:10, she began watching the station signs. At 4:17, the train slowed and the conductor appeared in the doorway of her car. "Blackridge," he said, in the tone of a man announcing something he considers unremarkable. She stepped down onto the platform and the wind hit her immediately, pulling at her coat and her hat with something that felt almost contemptuous, as though the weather had been waiting to make a point. The platform was wooden, elevated slightly above the ground, running the length of the small building that served as Blackridge's train station. It was perhaps 60 feet long. There was a bench at one end, a lamppost at the other, the lamp not yet lit. The station building itself had a window through which she could see a man seated at a desk, not looking up. She stood and she looked at the platform. She looked at both ends of the platform. She looked at the single dirt road that ran away from the station into what was apparently the town of Blackridge, which from this vantage point appeared to consist of perhaps 15 buildings, several of them looking uncertain about their futures. There was no one waiting. She stood very still for a moment while the other passengers moved around her. The family with 3 children, the 2 men with the suits, the older woman with the crackers, who gave Eleanor one brief, comprehensive look, the look of someone who has seen this before and has made peace with the fact that the world contains a great number of this particular kind of disappointment, and then walked briskly away toward a wagon where someone was already waiting to collect her. Eleanor set down her trunk. Her smaller bag she kept in her hand. She waited 15 minutes by the station clock, which was visible through the window. Then 20. A railroad man emerged from the station building and began hanging lanterns along the platform because the light was going. He glanced at Eleanor with the impersonal acknowledgement of a man accustomed to people waiting for things that didn't arrive. He didn't ask if she needed help. She didn't ask for it. 30 minutes. The train she had arrived on had already gone. The platform was otherwise empty. The road into town was empty. The enormous sky above Blackridge was going the color of a bruise, purple and blue and something darker at the edges. And the mountains had turned black against it with the indifference of things that have witnessed a great deal of human disappointment and found it unworthy of comment. Eleanor opened her leather portfolio and read Caleb's last letter again. October 14th, the 4:15 train from Billings. She had not misread it. She had not miscounted the days. She was in the right place at the right time, and she was entirely, completely alone. She felt the first thing clearly, which was confusion. She catalogued the explanations with the practiced efficiency of someone who learned early that panic is only useful after you have exhausted the logical possibilities. He was delayed. There had been an accident on the road, not serious, just enough to put him behind schedule. He had the date wrong. He had the train wrong. There was more than one station. She examined each explanation and found all of them possible and none of them convincing. The second thing she felt was harder to name. It sat somewhere between embarrassment and something more physical, a kind of contraction in her chest, a gathering in, as though her body was trying to make itself smaller in response to something threatening. She had stood on a train platform in a place she had never been, in a territory she did not know, and waited for a man she had never met, and the man had not come, and 23 letters were paper and ink, and this was Montana. She made herself breathe. She was not going to stand here and make this worse by standing here. She picked up her trunk. It was heavier than she had packed it, she thought irrationally, which didn't make any sense, but exhaustion does strange things to logic. She carried it to the bench at the end of the platform and sat down on it and tried to think clearly about what she could actually do. She had $31. She had established this on the train, counting through her purse twice for the comfort of certainty. $31 was not enough to get back to Boston. It was enough, perhaps, to get to Billings. She could write to her father. He would send money. She would go home having spent her savings on a journey based on the word of a man she had never met in person. And she would stand in her father's pharmacy and he would not say, "I told you so," because he was not that kind of man. And somehow that would be worse. She sat on the bench and the temperature dropped, and she sat with the specific dignity of someone who absolutely refuses to cry in public, though she had never in her life wanted to cry in public more than she did in that moment. The station attendant put out his lamp and locked the station building and tipped his hat at her briefly and then left, which did not improve the situation. She was alone on the platform in the dark and the cold, and something inside her that had been held together with 14 letters and a good deal of hope was doing something she could feel but didn't want to examine directly. She did not hear him approach. She became aware of him the way you become aware of things at the edge of darkness. Not all at once, but in increments. A footstep on the wooden platform, the sound of a horse somewhere behind the station, a presence that entered her peripheral vision without particular drama, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who lives somewhere he does not feel the need to hurry. He stopped about 8 feet away from her, which she registered as a considerate distance. She looked up. He was tall. She noticed that first. He was wearing a wool coat that had seen better decades and a hat that had been pushed back at an angle that suggested function over intention. He was perhaps 35, or could have been 40. The kind of face that the outdoors ages without making older, if that distinction makes any sense. His jaw was slightly rough with a day or two of not shaving. His eyes, in the low light, were some dark color she couldn't determine. He was holding a lantern. He held it at his side, not raised, as though he wasn't trying to illuminate her specifically, just carrying it because the dark was dark. He looked at her. He looked at the trunk. He looked at the empty platform. He did not say, "Somebody leave you?" He did not say, "You seem to be in a difficult situation." He did not say anything that would have required her to respond to her own situation in terms she was not ready to use yet. What he said was, "Train come in a while ago." "Yes," she said. "You waiting on another one?" She considered lying. She was not normally a person who lied, but the truth, in this particular moment, felt too large and too humiliating to hand to a stranger on a dark platform. "No," she said. He looked out at the road into town. Henderson's hotel keeps a room or two. Mrs. Henderson doesn't much like people arriving after supper, but she won't turn away a woman traveling alone. I know that from reasonable certainty. Eleanor looked at him. "Are you from Blackridge?" "Ranch outside it." She made a decision then, which wasn't a dramatic decision. It was the kind of decision you make when you have run out of alternatives, and the only real choice is what kind of person you intend to be while you figure out your next move. She stood up. She picked up her smaller bag. She looked at the trunk. "I can manage that," he said, stepping forward. He picked up the trunk as though it did not weigh what it weighed. He turned toward the road and then stopped, because she hadn't started walking yet. "I don't know your name," she said. It mattered to her suddenly. She was not going to follow a man into the dark in a town she didn't know without at least knowing his name. He turned back and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not exactly surprise, but the recognition of someone confronted with a reasonable request they had failed to consider. He shifted the trunk to his other hand. "Silas," he said. "Silas Granger." She looked at him for a moment. He waited. "Eleanor Hayes," she said. "I'm from Boston. I came here—" She stopped. Something in her throat closed. She had been going to explain the whole thing. The letters, Caleb Mercer, the plan that had failed completely. And she found she could not say any of it out loud yet, without the risk of something coming apart that she needed to keep together for a little while longer. Silas Granger did not push. He said, "Long way." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." He turned toward the road again. She fell into step beside him. The town of Blackridge lay ahead. 15 buildings and a dark sky and the mountains behind everything like they'd been there since before anything else and planned on staying. So, the Henderson Hotel was the second largest building on Blackridge's main street, preceded in size only by the general store and trailing just ahead of the livery stable, which Eleanor learned later had been built by the same man who owned the hotel, which explained quite a lot about both. The woman behind the counter at the hotel was broad-shouldered, somewhere in her 50s, with the expression of someone who had been doing something important before they were interrupted and wanted that fact acknowledged. She was wearing a gray dress, and her hair was up in the efficient, undecorated way of a woman who had not needed to impress anyone with her hair for a considerable number of years. "Silas," she said, looking at him. "Evening, Ruth. This is Miss Hayes. She needs a room." He set the trunk down. "She's a respectable woman traveling alone, and she's had a long journey. Whatever rate's fair." Ruth Henderson looked at Eleanor with the comprehensive efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing strangers quickly. She looked at the trunk. She looked back at Silas with an expression that was asking something. He returned with a slight, steady look that said, "Not tonight." "I have a room on the second floor," Ruth said, turning back to Eleanor. 40 cents a night. Supper's past, but I can arrange cold ham and bread." "That would be very kind," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "You all right?" Ruth asked. Not warmly, exactly, but directly. The question of a woman who prefers to know what she's dealing with. Eleanor thought about the honest answer to that question, which was complicated and long and would have required unpacking a trunk's worth of feelings she wasn't ready to examine in front of people she'd met 9 minutes ago. "I'm managing," she said. "Thank you." Ruth nodded. The nod of someone who recognizes managing as the most honest thing a person can say and respects it. She reached for a key on the board behind her. Eleanor turned to thank Silas Granger. He was already by the door, hat in his hand, the lantern set down beside the trunk. He looked like a man who had delivered something and was uncertain whether to stay or go, and had defaulted to go because it seemed less presumptuous. "Mr. Granger," she said. He looked up. She wanted to say something adequate. She had spent 2 years composing letters with care and precision, finding words for things that mattered, and standing here in the lobby of a hotel in a town she didn't know, exhausted and humiliated and holding herself together with what felt like insufficient materials, she could not find a single sentence that was equal to the thing she wanted to express. "Thank you," she said, "for not asking me questions." He held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his face that she couldn't read. Not pity, she was nearly certain, which would have been unbearable. Something quieter than that. "Tomorrow's another day," he said. Not as encouragement exactly, just as a fact. He put on his hat, nodded once at Ruth, and walked out into the dark. Eleanor stood in the lobby of the Henderson Hotel in Blackridge, Montana, listening to his footsteps cross the porch and descend to the street. The cold came in briefly through the door as it swung shut and then was gone. Ruth Henderson came around the counter and picked up the trunk with surprising ease. "I'll put this up. Come along," she said, starting for the stairs without waiting to see if Eleanor would follow. Because some women know that hesitation, given too much room, becomes paralysis, and the best thing you can do is simply keep moving and trust the other person to do the same. Eleanor followed. The room was small. The bed had a quilt on it that was worn at one corner but clean everywhere, and someone had recently put fresh lavender somewhere she couldn't find. There was a washstand with a mirror above it that was slightly spotted from age. There was a window that faced east. Eleanor set her bag down on the chair. Ruth brought cold ham and 2 slices of bread on a plate and set it on the table without comment, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could say. When she was alone, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ham, which she was not hungry enough to eat, and the window, which was dark, and she let herself think about Caleb Mercer's 14 letters. She thought about all the things he had written: steady hands, steady work, steady sort of man. She thought about the eastern window. "I thought you ought to know about it." She thought about how a person builds a picture of someone from words on paper, and how that picture can feel so real you would cross a continent for it, and how the distance between a picture and a person can be, as she had now discovered firsthand, exactly the distance between Boston and Blackridge, Montana. She was very tired. She was humiliated in a way that was going to take a while to fully arrive. She could sense that. It was still on its way, the complete weight of it, and she was grateful for the delay. She was in a strange town with $31 and no plan that she could presently see the end of. She put the letters on the table, not dramatically. She didn't throw them or do anything with them that would have been satisfying in a novel. She just set them there, the leather portfolio, and took off her coat and washed her face and ate 3 bites of the ham because she needed to eat something even if she wasn't hungry. And she got into the bed with the worn quilt and the faint smell of lavender, and she lay in the dark. Tomorrow's another day. She didn't know if she believed that yet, but she was going to act as if she did, which had always been her functional approach to things she wasn't sure about. You act as if, and sometimes the acting becomes believing, and sometimes it doesn't, but it gets you through the night either way. Outside, the wind off the Montana mountains moved through Black Ridge in long, unimpressed sweeps. The town was quiet. The sky was full of stars in the reckless abundance that only becomes visible when you are far enough away from everything. Eleanor Hayes lay in the dark and did not sleep for a long time, and when she finally did, she dreamed of nothing she could remember in the morning, which was, probably, the kindest thing her mind could offer her. She did not sleep past 5:30. Old habit, her father used to say. The pharmacy opened at 7, and Eleanor had spent enough years rising before the light that her body had stopped consulting her about it. She lay in the narrow bed at Henderson's hotel and watched the window go from black to gray to something pale and indefinite, and she made herself think practically, which was the only way she knew to approach a situation that would otherwise swallow her whole. The $31 were still in her purse. That hadn't changed in the night. What had changed slightly was her understanding of her options. In the dark hours before sleep finally came, she had examined each one with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to balancing accounts, and by morning she had arrived at a kind of inventory. She could not go home. Not immediately. Not without money she did not have. She could look for work in Black Ridge, though she had no clear picture of what work was available to a woman with her particular set of skills in a frontier town of approximately 200 people. She could write her father and wait for money, but the wait would be weeks and she would spend what she had on the hotel and arrive home with nothing, which felt like the wrong kind of lesson to return with. She washed her face, she braided her hair, she put on the most practical dress she had packed, dark blue wool, minimal ornamentation, and she went downstairs. Ruth Henderson was already in the kitchen. The smell of coffee reached Eleanor before she reached the bottom of the stairs, and she followed it the way a person follows the one good thing available. "You want breakfast," Ruth said. It was not a question. "Yes, and I'd like to pay for it in the room separately, if that's all right. I need to keep track of what I'm spending." Ruth gave her that same comprehensive look from the night before, slightly softened by morning and proximity. She set a cup of coffee on the table and pointed at the chair across from it. "Sit." Eleanor sat. "You're not what I expected," Ruth said, settling herself across the table with her own cup. "What did you expect?" Woman abandoned on a train platform usually comes in one of two conditions. Either she's been crying so long she can't stop, or she's so angry she can't see straight. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was strong enough to make her eyes water, which she appreciated. "I may still get there," she said, "on both counts." Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but acknowledged the humor. "Who are you coming to meet?" "A man named Caleb Mercer. He claimed to have a ranch outside Black Ridge." Ruth went very still. It was a particular kind of stillness, not the absence of reaction, but the control of one, the stillness of someone who has just received information they are carefully deciding what to do with. "You know him," Eleanor said. "I know of him." Ruth set down her cup. She looked at Eleanor with the particular directness of a woman who believes in delivering uncomfortable information without decoration. "He's been through Black Ridge twice in the past year, doesn't have a ranch outside of town, has a room at Morrison's boarding house in Billings, last I heard." She paused. "This isn't the first time I've heard his name in connection with a woman coming in on the train." The information landed somewhere in Eleanor's chest with the specific weight of a thing that explains everything and helps nothing simultaneously. She heard it, processed it, and set it carefully aside, somewhere she could examine it later without the risk of it undoing her entirely. "All right," she said. Ruth looked at her. "That's all?" "For now." She picked up her coffee. "Is there any work available in Black Ridge? I have bookkeeping experience. I managed accounts for my father's pharmacy in Boston for 2 years." Ruth studied her for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the stove and began spooning eggs onto a plate. "Eat first," she said. "Then I'll tell you something." What? What Ruth told her, over eggs and 2 slices of toast, was that Silas Granger's ranch had been running without a bookkeeper since his previous one, an older man named Fowler, had left for Denver in June on account of his wife's health. The ranch ledgers, she understood from what Silas had mentioned in passing, were in a condition that he described as behind, which in Ruth's experience of ranchers meant somewhere between disorganized and catastrophic. "He's a proud man," Ruth said. "Doesn't ask for things easily, but his operation is solid. Been running the Granger place since his father passed 8 years ago. He's not going to lose it, but he might lose track of it." She refilled Eleanor's cup without being asked. "Whether he'd take on a woman as a bookkeeper, I can't say. Some men wouldn't, out of principle." "Would he?" Ruth considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "He brought you here last night without asking you what happened. That tells you something about the man." Eleanor thought about Silas Granger standing on the dark platform with a lantern held at his side, and the 8 feet of space he'd kept between them. And tomorrow's another day delivered as fact rather than comfort. "I'd like to speak with him," she said. She did not have to wait long. Silas Granger appeared at the hotel's front door before 8 o'clock, hat in hand, with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who had come to do something he was uncertain how to do. He had, apparently, come to check that she was still there. Or perhaps that she was all right, though she suspected he would not have phrased it that way if asked. Ruth let him in and disappeared into the kitchen with the tact of a woman who knows when a room needs fewer people in it. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Granger." She was standing, which she had decided on deliberately. She didn't want to receive him sitting down, as though she were the one in a position of needing help. "I understand your ranch ledgers need attention." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. A quick recalibration, the adjustment of a man who came prepared for one conversation and found himself in a different one. "Ruth talks," he said. "She mentioned it. I'm asking because I have bookkeeping experience and I need work. I'm not in a position to go back east immediately, and I would rather earn my circumstances than wait for them." She kept her voice even. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Granger. I'm asking for a fair arrangement. Work for pay. If my work isn't satisfactory after 2 weeks, you owe me nothing but whatever hours I've given." He was quiet for longer than most people would have been comfortable with. Eleanor was learning, though she didn't know she was learning it yet, that Silas Granger's silences were not the absence of thought. They were where his thinking happened. "You know cattle ranching accounts?" he said finally. "I know accounts. I can learn the particulars." "Fowler's been gone 4 months. The books are—" He stopped. "Bad? Let's say they need someone with patience." "I have considerable patience," Eleanor said, "when the work is honest." Something moved across his face that might, in a more expressive man, have qualified as a smile. $2 a week, he said, plus dinner at the house, noon and evening. You'll board here in town. That's your own arrangement. He paused. The work is Monday through Saturday. Sundays are your own. It was fair. It was more than fair, actually, and she thought he probably knew that, and she decided not to examine his reasons too closely because she needed the work, and the offer was clean, and that was enough for today. Agreed, she said. When do I start? Today, he said. If you're ready. She picked up her coat from the chair by the door. I'm ready. The Granger Ranch sat 4 miles outside Black Ridge on a road that was more intention than infrastructure. 2 tracks in the earth separated by a strip of grass, running between fences and then through open land and then rising slightly before the buildings came into view. There was a main house, substantial but plain, built of timber that had weathered to a deep gray. A barn. 3 outbuildings of varying purpose. A corral that held 5 horses, one of which was standing at the far fence with its back to everyone else in a manner that could only be described as deliberate. Is that Bonaparte? Eleanor asked. Silas glanced at the horse. You read my letters. She caught herself. She had said it without thinking. Of course she had read his letters. She had read everyone's letters when she came west. She had been so hungry for the particular texture of this place that she had absorbed details she didn't know she had retained. But she had not told Silas Granger last night that she had come to Black Ridge for Caleb Mercer, and she had not told him that Caleb Mercer had described Black Ridge in his letters in ways that now struck her as being mostly borrowed from the actual life of the people who actually lived here. "I heard about the horse," she said, which was close enough to true that she let it stand. He looked at her for a moment with that measuring quality she was beginning to recognize as his default mode of attention. Not suspicious, exactly, but thorough. And then he looked back at the road and said nothing more. The office, if you could call it that, was a room off the back of the main house that Silas had clearly been using for everything that couldn't be done outside. There was a desk that held a lamp, 3 coffee cups in various states of abandonment, a broken piece of harness that had no clear reason to be there, and 4 large ledger books in a condition that Eleanor surveyed with the quiet expression of a surgeon assessing something that has been left too long. "Fowler kept it through February," Silas said from the doorway. "After that I did my best." Eleanor picked up the most recent ledger. She opened it to a page dated April, looked at the entries, turned to May, looked at the entries there, and then carefully set the book back down. "I'll need a full day to understand the system," she said, or the absence of one. "Take what you need." He moved the harness piece from the desk to the floor without appearing to notice he was doing it. "Coffee's in the kitchen. Help yourself." "Mr. Granger." He turned. "Thank you for the work. I want to be useful here, not I want to be useful." She had started to say not a charity case, but stopped herself because she'd already said it once, and saying it twice would make it a declaration of something vulnerable she didn't want witnessed. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. "I know," he said, and he went out. She spent the first day doing nothing but reading. Not working, reading, going through each ledger from the point where Fowler's meticulous hand gave way to Silas's less confident one, mapping the system that had been and the system that had evolved in its absence. She made notes in a small notebook she had brought from Boston, which was the kind of habit her father had instilled in her. You don't touch the thing until you understand it. At noon, Silas's ranch hand, a weathered, angular man of about 50 named Pete, who communicated primarily in nods and monosyllables and treated Eleanor's presence with the neutral pragmatism of someone who had long ago stopped expecting to understand all of Silas's decisions, appeared in the doorway and said, "Food." She ate at the kitchen table. Silas came in from outside with the particular deliberateness of a man who has been working since before the light and is not interested in being questioned about it. He sat across from her. They ate. Biscuits and some kind of stew with beans and a piece of cornbread that had seen better days but was better than nothing. And they did not talk very much, and it was not, Eleanor noticed, an uncomfortable silence. It was more like 2 people who are each too busy thinking about their own problems to require entertainment from each other. "You were in the pharmacy business?" Silas said, after a while. "My father's. I managed the accounts and helped with inventory. Orders, suppliers, that sort of thing." She broke the cornbread. "He has a good business. He'll be fine without me." "You're not going back." It wasn't a question, quite. She looked at him across the table. "Not immediately," she said. "I need to—" She stopped. There was a shape to the thing she couldn't complete right now. She needed to not go back as the woman who had been fool enough to cross the country for a lie, was what she needed. She needed to go back, if she went back, as someone who had managed, who had made something out of the wreckage. She couldn't explain that to a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. "This stew is better than it looks," she said instead. Something shifted in his face, that almost smile again. "Pete made it. Don't tell him you said that. He's already insufferable about his cooking." She laughed. It surprised her. The realness of it, how it came out without warning or permission. She saw it register on Silas's face, too, the slight lift of surprise, as though he had been expecting a different kind of woman and was in the ongoing process of adjusting his expectations. The second week was harder than the first, because by the second week she understood the full extent of the damage, and understanding a problem fully is considerably more difficult than identifying it. The books were not dishonest. Silas kept track of what he spent and what he took in, mostly. But they were incomplete in the particular way of a man who understands money in the practical sense of having it or not having it, without possessing the vocabulary to record it systematically. Cattle sold, but the recording was inconsistent. Feed purchased against credit at the general store. She found evidence of this in 3 different places in 2 different ledgers, and the amounts didn't match. There was a loan from a bank in Billings that appeared in February and then disappeared, and she couldn't find it again until June, and the interest had been calculated twice. She put these things in order with the patient, slightly grim satisfaction of someone good at a particular kind of work who has found work that genuinely needs doing. She was not romantic about it. It was not beautiful work. It was columns of numbers and cross-referencing and occasionally sitting back from the desk with her eyes closed because the arithmetic was making her head ache, and the room got cold in the afternoons. On the 9th day, she found a discrepancy of $63 in the cattle accounts from the previous year that turned out to be, once she traced it back through 3 ledgers, an error in Fowler's favor. He had been taking a small commission on feed purchases that Silas had never agreed to and possibly never noticed. She sat with this information for an hour, making sure she had it right, checking it twice more, and then she brought the relevant ledgers to the kitchen where Silas was drinking coffee at the end of the day, and she put them on the table in front of him and showed him. He looked at the figures for a long time. "Fowler," he said. He said it the way a person says a name they are reconsidering. "Over about 14 months. Eleanor sat down across from him. "It's not a great deal of money in the context of the whole operation, but it's yours. Can't collect it. He's in Denver." "I know. I'm not telling you so you can collect it. I'm telling you because you should know." She paused. "And because I wanted you to see why the accounts weren't balancing the way they should." He looked at the ledger and then at her. "You didn't have to find that. I was going to find it eventually. It was there." She moved the ledger slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table because the misalignment bothered her. "It's your ranch, Mr. Granger. You should know what's in it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard in long, easy gusts that set something creaking against the barn wall in the rhythmic, almost meditative way of a country that is comfortable with its own sounds. "Silas," he said. She looked up. "Call me Silas. Mr. Granger sounds like my father." He picked up his coffee cup and then put it down without drinking from it. "He wasn't a bad man, my father, but I'd rather be my own thing than an echo of him." Eleanor nodded. "Eleanor, then?" She paused. "Though I've spent enough time in this office staring at your ledgers that I feel I have a fairly thorough acquaintance with you already. What did they tell you?" She considered this seriously. "You're cautious with money you have and reckless with credit. You replaced the barn roof last summer when it probably could have waited another year, which tells me you make decisions based on what should be done rather than what you can strictly afford. You bought a second horse in March when the accounts were already tight." She glanced toward the corral, where Bonaparte was presumably still maintaining his grievances against the world. "I'm guessing that was Bonaparte." Silas Granger looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite amusement, and not quite wariness, something that lived between the two. "He was going to be put down," he said. "Previous owner gave up on him. So you bought a horse nobody else wanted because you thought he deserved better." A pause. "He's a good horse. When he decides to be." "Of course." She gathered the ledgers. "Reckless with credit," she repeated mildly, and went back to the office. The coffee started appearing on the 3rd week. She noticed it the first morning, a cup, already poured, sitting on the edge of the desk when she arrived. She was not certain enough of its origin to say anything. She picked it up and drank it and went to work. The 2nd morning, it was there again. And the 3rd. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. The coffee simply appeared each morning with the reliability of a thing that has become part of a routine without any formal agreement. And she found herself, after the 1st week of it, arriving at the desk and feeling the absence of the cup on the mornings. It wasn't ready yet in a way that was disproportionate to the significance of a cup of coffee, or at least should have been. She was not naive enough to misread it. She was also not experienced enough with Silas Granger's particular dialect of care, which was practical, unannounced, and entirely without ceremony, to know what to do with it. So she did nothing, which seemed consistent with what he was doing, which was also nothing, in the way that people sometimes do nothing about something because doing something would require acknowledging that the something exists. The town was a different matter. Blackridge was small enough that by the 2nd week, everyone knew she was working at the Granger Ranch, and small enough that this information had been processed and distributed through the community with the efficient speed of people who don't have a great deal of other news to work with. She heard it in the way Ruth Henderson asked how things were going out at the ranch, in the way the woman at the general store asked where she was sending her supply orders now, in the careful neutrality of Mrs. Patterson at the post office, who gave her letters to her father with the specific expression of someone actively choosing not to ask questions. She also heard something else, underneath all that, which was the quieter current of opinion about what exactly she was doing working at Silas Granger's ranch, and for whom, and whether that was the kind of thing a respectable woman did. Nobody said it directly. Nobody was unkind, precisely. It was more like a question the town was living with, watching to see how it resolved itself. Eleanor found she did not have much energy to spend on this. She had enough to manage. One afternoon in late October, she stayed past the usual hour because she was in the middle of reconciling the year's cattle accounts, and she wanted to finish the thought before she lost it. The light outside had gone orange and then gray by the time she put down her pen. She realized she had been sitting in that chair for going on 9 hours with only brief intervals, which was longer than she'd intended, and her back registered this fact with the emphatic specificity of someone who had not been consulted. She stood, stretched badly, gathered her coat, and walked through to the main room to let Silas know she was leaving. He was sitting at the table with his own paperwork. She'd started giving him brief weekly summaries in a format she'd designed for clarity, and he was apparently reading one. And he looked up when she came in. "You're still here," he said. "I'm leaving now. I wanted to finish the October cattle total." "You eat?" She thought about this. "Not since noon." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested he had opinions about this. Then he stood up from the table and went to the stove. "Sit down," he said. "I can get something in town. Town's 4 miles. Sit down." He said it with the particular inflection of someone who is not accustomed to arguing but is also not going to stop once he's started. She sat down. He put a plate in front of her, leftover beans from dinner, a piece of bread, some sliced meat she thought might be venison, and then sat back down across from her with his own paperwork and continued reading his summary as though she had always been sitting there in the evenings. She ate. The food was cold and not particularly interesting, and she ate all of it. "You should eat during the day," he said, without looking up. "Not a suggestion." "I get absorbed," she said. "So does Bonaparte when he's sulking. Doesn't mean it's a good habit." She looked at him. He was making a mark on the summary with a pencil, his attention apparently on the page. The lamplight fell across his face in the particular way of lamplight in rooms that don't have enough windows, which is to say, directly and without flattery, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who worked hard and slept honestly, and had somewhere along the way decided that she should have coffee in the morning and not go hungry working late in his house. She was not going to think about this too carefully. She was going to eat her cold beans and go home to Henderson's hotel and write a letter to her father, who she had been telling that she had found work and was managing without telling him the work was with the man who had come to get her off a dark train platform. "The October total reconciles," she said, "within a reasonable margin." "That's good news?" "For this particular set of books, yes. It means nobody stole anything in October." She paused. "That we know of." He looked up at that. "You think someone still—" "No, I'm being dry. The books for October are fine." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "You're funny," he said, as though he'd only just arrived at this conclusion and was mildly surprised by it. "I have my moments." She pushed the empty plate away. "Thank you for dinner." "Cold beans aren't dinner." "They were tonight." She stood, put on her coat. "I'll be back Monday." He walked her to the door, which she had noticed he always did. Not elaborately, not with any ceremony, just stood up when she was leaving and accompanied her the 20 feet from the kitchen to the front door, as though leaving a woman to navigate the distance alone was something he had decided against without making an announcement about it. She stepped out into the cold. The sky was enormous and dark, and full of stars in the way she had begun to think of as particular to this place, as though distance from everything else meant proximity to something else. "Good night, Silas." "Night." He stood in the doorway, the lamp behind him. "Monday, then." She walked to where Pete had left the horse and wagon for her, another unannounced arrangement, and climbed up and drove the 4 miles back to Black Ridge in the dark, with the cold on her face and the smell of wood smoke coming from the buildings as she entered town, She passed the train station on her way back to Henderson's hotel. The platform was empty, as it always was at this hour. The bench where she'd sat the night she arrived was still there, of course. Benches don't move. And in the dark, it was just a bench on a platform in a small town, nothing particular about it. But she looked at it as she drove past. She had arrived in this town with $31 and no plan and a portfolio of letters from a man who had never intended to meet her. And she had been sitting on that bench ready to understand herself as a woman defined by that humiliation, abandoned, fooled, finished before she'd started. She was not that woman. She was not certain yet what woman she was becoming, out here at the edge of everything, with her cold beans and her ledgers and her morning coffee and the quiet company of a man who said few things but meant all of them. But she was becoming something. She was sure of that much. The wagon rolled down Blackridge's main street in the dark, and Eleanor Hayes sat up straight in it, and she drove herself home. November came to Blackridge the way it always did out here. Not gradually, not with any of the gentle transitional courtesy that autumn managed in the east, but all at once, like a door being shut firmly by someone who meant it. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night and didn't come back up. The sky took on the particular flat white quality of a sky that is seriously considering snow and has mostly made up its mind. The mountains disappeared behind cloud cover for days at a time, and when they reappeared they were white down to the tree line, which Pete observed was earlier than last year, and meant something, though he didn't elaborate on what. Eleanor had been in Blackridge 6 weeks. She had stopped counting the days somewhere around week 4, which she took as a sign of something. She wasn't sure what, exactly. Adaptation, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. She had developed routines, which was how she'd always known she was settling into something, whether she wanted to or not. Coffee at Henderson's before the wagon came. 4 miles out to the ranch with Pete driving and not talking, which she had come to appreciate as one of the more honest conversational styles available. The office, the ledgers, the particular satisfaction of a column that balanced. Noon dinner, then the afternoon, then the cold drive back to town as the light failed. The books were in better condition now. Not good. She was too honest with herself to call them good yet, but better. She could see the shape of the operation clearly, which was the necessary precondition for actually helping it rather than just understanding its problems. Silas's ranch was not failing. It was not prospering either, but it was a solid thing with the potential for solidity, if managed with care going forward. She had told him this in her second weekly summary, and he had read it twice and then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, which was the closest she'd seen him come to visibly pleased about something. The morning coffee was still there every day. She had stopped pretending she didn't notice. She had written to her father twice. She had told him she was working, that the work was honest, that she was managing. She had told him the town was small but decent, and that the Montana sky was something she could not adequately describe in a letter. She had not told him about Caleb Mercer, the fact of him, the full humiliation of the empty platform, because she was still working out how to explain a thing she didn't entirely understand herself. She had not told him about Silas Granger either, for different reasons that she also wasn't ready to examine directly. Her father's replies came every 2 weeks with the regularity she had always associated with him, and they contained the careful news of Tremont Street, the pharmacy, the neighbors, the weather in Boston. And at the end of each one, written in the same neat script as everything else, 2 words: come home. She folded those letters and kept them in the leather portfolio alongside Caleb's. She wasn't sure what that meant. She thought it probably meant something. It was on a Wednesday in the second week of November that everything changed, though she didn't know it was going to be that kind of Wednesday when she woke up. The morning was ordinary in all its particulars. Cold, flat white sky. Coffee at Henderson's while Ruth moved around the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has a great deal to accomplish before noon. Pete arrived at 7:30 and said nothing of significance on the drive out. The office was cold until she got the small stove lit, and the stove took 3 attempts to light because the flu had developed opinions about the wind direction. She was going through a folder of purchase receipts from the previous year, the last ungoverned pile of paper in the filing system she'd been building, when she found the envelope. It was mixed in with the purchase receipts, which was how she almost missed it. A regular envelope, already opened, addressed to Silas at the ranch. She would have put it with the other correspondence she'd filed. She'd been sorting his mail too, organizing it by date and type. But something made her look at the return address. Billings, a law office. Henderson and Crow, attorneys at law. She almost set it aside. It was not her correspondence, and it was already filed as someone's business, and she had a clear personal policy about that sort of thing. She organized. She did not read. She did not insert herself into matters that weren't hers. She had maintained this policy through 6 weeks of handling another man's financial life, and she was proud of it. But the date on the envelope stopped her hand. It was dated August of this year, and in the upper left corner, in small print beneath the law firm's name, there was a case reference number, and next to it, a name. Ree Mercer, C. Matter of fraud. She stood very still with the envelope in her hand. She could hear Pete outside doing something with the equipment and the small stove ticking as it warmed, and somewhere the horse that was not Bonaparte moving in the corral with the heavy, unhurried movement of horses in cold weather. She took the letter out of the envelope. She told herself afterward that she had done it because she needed to understand what she was dealing with, and that was true as far as it went. But she was also honest enough to acknowledge, in the private accounting she kept of her own motives, that she would have read it regardless, because the name on that case reference had reached into her chest and grabbed something she had been carefully keeping still for 6 weeks. The letter was 1 page, written in the formal, dense language of legal correspondence. It informed Mr. Granger that the office of Henderson and Crow was representing a matter involving a Mr. Caleb Mercer of Billings, Montana, regarding allegations of fraud and deceptive misrepresentation perpetrated against multiple women across the territory. It stated that several women had come forward, that a pattern of behavior had been established, and that Mr. Mercer's method of operation involved the use of false personal advertisements and fabricated correspondence to solicit money and travel from women under fraudulent pretenses of marriage. It asked, at the bottom, whether Mr. Granger had knowledge of any women who had been affected by this scheme, as the attorneys were building a case and any information would be received confidentially. Eleanor read the letter once, then she read it again. Then she sat down on the desk chair and looked at the wall for a period of time she couldn't have measured. There it was. The whole shape of it, finally visible. Not a man delayed on the road. Not a misunderstanding. Not a miscommunication that could have been sorted with an explanation and some goodwill and the kind of second-chance generosity that Eleanor had always been better at extending than she probably should have been. A scheme. Her name in a column somewhere alongside other women, other towns, other train platforms. The letter was dated August. She had arrived in October. Silas had received this letter 10 weeks before she stepped off that train, which meant that when he had come to the platform that night and found her sitting alone in the dark, he had already known, or suspected, who she had come to meet. She sat with this for a long time. Then she picked up the letter and walked through to the kitchen. Silas came in from outside while she was standing at the table. He came in the way he always did at this hour, removing his hat, reaching for the coffee pot, and then he saw her face, and he stopped. She put the letter on the table. He looked at it, then at her. "You knew," she said. Her voice was quiet. She had not decided in advance what register to use, and her voice had decided for her, which turned out to be quiet and very level, the voice of someone who is not going to give anger the satisfaction of arriving early. Silas set the coffee pot down. "Not when I found you," he said. "I knew there'd been women. I didn't know who specifically or when. I got that letter, and I didn't—" He stopped. "I thought about going to the station more often, after I got it. But you came that night." "I come to the station most nights the train arrives. It's a small town." He looked at the letter on the table and then at her. "I didn't know it would be you. But when you saw me, I put it together." He said it plainly, without apology, and without excessive explanation, which was characteristic. "Woman alone, no one meeting her, the way you looked. I put it together." Eleanor absorbed this. She turned the information over carefully, the way she turned financial discrepancies over, looking for the place where the numbers lied, the place where something was hidden that changed the shape of everything. She didn't find one. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "You've had 6 weeks." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing between several different answers, which was unusual for him. He was not typically a man who had multiple answers to choose between. "You were managing," he said. "You were—" He stopped again. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table and then put it down again. "You weren't ready to hear it. And then later—" He paused. I didn't know how. You didn't know how, she repeated. No. She looked at him across the kitchen. He was a man who had known, and who had brought her there anyway, and had given her work and coffee and had not told her the truth because he didn't know how to. She was trying to decide how to hold all of that at once. I'm not angry at you, she said finally. I want to be clear about that, but I need... She stopped. Something was moving through her chest that required careful management. I need a few minutes. Take what you need, he said. She went back to the office and closed the door and sat at the desk. She put her hands flat on the surface of the desk and looked at them. Caleb Mercer had written her 14 letters. She had read them so many times she could have reconstructed them from memory. She had packed her trunk and kissed her father and crossed half a country for the voice in those letters. And the voice had been a performance, assembled with enough truth borrowed from other people's real lives. Bonaparte, and a window that faced east, and the honest texture of small things, to feel genuine to a woman who had been, she understood now, hungry enough for the real thing that she had not looked closely enough at what she was being offered. She had been fooled, completely, systematically, by a man who had done this before and would do it again if no one stopped him. She sat with the full weight of that for the first time. She had been keeping it at a distance for 6 weeks, functioning around it, making it small enough to live beside, and now it was here, actual size, and it was enormous and humiliating, and it made her furious in a way that was clean and hot and clarifying. She let herself be furious for a few minutes. Alone, in the cold office, with the stove ticking and the flat white sky visible through the single window. She let it arrive and move through her, and she did not dress it up or apologize for it. She was furious at Caleb Mercer, who had written beautiful lies with someone else's life as his raw material. She was furious at herself, in the measured way she allowed, enough to learn from, not enough to drown in. She was furious at the distance between a letter and a person, and at the way that distance had looked for a while, like hope. And then the fury shifted the way it does when you've let it run its full course without interruption, and what was underneath it was something quieter and less comfortable, which was grief. Not grief for Caleb Mercer, who had never existed in the form she had loved. Grief for the woman who had read those letters in her bedroom in Boston and believed she recognized something real in them. Grief for the wanting itself, the specific, honest want of a woman who had been managing her small, reliable circle of days for years and had seen in 14 letters a door to something larger. She gave herself the grief too. It deserved that. Then she stood up, straightened her skirt, and went back to the kitchen. Silas was at the table. He had poured 2 cups of coffee and was sitting with his hands around one of them, not drinking it. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him. She pulled the second cup toward her. Tell me what you know about this law firm, she said. Henderson and Crow. He told her. It was a reputable office in Billings, as far as he knew. The attorney who had written was named James Crow, who had a decent reputation for handling difficult cases. There were apparently at least 4 women that the office knew of, possibly more. And Mercer himself? Still in Billings, last anyone heard. Hasn't been charged with anything yet because, he paused, because the women aren't all willing to come forward. You understand why, the situation, for a woman to stand up and say she was fooled like that, in a town where everyone... I understand, Eleanor said. The case needs more than what they have. That's what the letter said. She thought about this. She thought about 4 women, possibly more, sitting in their respective rooms in their respective towns, managing, the way she'd been managing, carrying the shape of what had been done to them quietly because the alternative was being defined by it publicly. Outside, the wind picked up, moving against the house with the particular low sound of November in Montana, which was not a comforting sound but was at least an honest one. The news reached town 2 days later, which was faster than Eleanor expected, but Blackridge was small, and word moved through it the way water moves through flat ground, finding every available path without effort. She was at the general store when she first heard it openly. A woman named Clara Whitmore, who was perhaps 45 and whose husband ran the feed operation on the south edge of town, said to the woman next to her in a voice calibrated precisely to be audible, "Heard Mercer's been arrested in Billings. Fraud charges. Multiple women. Can you imagine?" And then Clara Whitmore had looked directly at Eleanor with the specific look of someone who wants to be certain their information has landed, Eleanor picked up the bolt of wool she'd been examining and set it back down and said, "Do you know the details?" In a perfectly ordinary voice, which was not entirely how she felt, but was how she chose to present. Clara Whitmore blinked. She had apparently expected a different response. "I heard it from Martha Henderson, not Ruth, the other one, who heard it from her cousin in Billings. They arrested him at his boarding house yesterday morning." "I see," Eleanor said. "Thank you for mentioning it." She purchased the 2 items she'd come for and left. By the following morning, everyone in Blackridge knew everything. Not all of it was accurate, which was predictable. The specifics of how Eleanor had come to be in Blackridge had been assembled from available evidence and community speculation, and the result was a story that was mostly true with some embellishments she could have done without. But the essential shape was right. She had come for Caleb Mercer, and he had not come. And he was, it turned out, a man who had done this to women across the territory for profit and sport. The response of Blackridge surprised her. She had expected a certain kind of pity that would require her to perform gratitude while absorbing condescension. She had expected some proportion of the community to be privately satisfied. There is always a proportion of any community that is privately satisfied by other people's humiliations, not out of cruelty exactly, but because it confirms that they, at least, have not made such mistakes. She had expected perhaps some discomfort, the specific discomfort people feel around the victims of frauds, because it raises the uncomfortable question of how easily they themselves might have been deceived. She got some of all of that, but mostly what she got was anger on her behalf, which she had not expected and which moved her more than she wanted it to. Tom Reardon, who ran the hardware store and had 4 daughters, in a manner that suggested he had been ready to fight on their behalf since each of them was born, stopped her on the street and said flatly, "That man ought to be prosecuted to the full extent of what the law allows, and I'll say so to whoever needs to hear it." He said it looking directly at her, not around her, not at the middle distance where people look when they're offering sympathy they don't entirely know how to deliver. He said it as a statement of position. She thanked him and meant it. Ruth Henderson said nothing directly. She put an extra portion at dinner that night and refilled Eleanor's coffee unprompted, and when Eleanor said, "Ruth," in the tone that precedes an acknowledgement, Ruth held up one hand and said, "Don't. I know." And that was that. It was the man from the saddle shop on the east end of Main Street who made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't anticipated. He was perhaps 60, a quiet man she had spoken to perhaps twice, and he stopped beside her outside the post office and said, "You came out here on good faith, Miss Hayes. That's not something to be ashamed of." And then he walked on without waiting for her to respond, which was exactly the right way to have said it. She stood outside this post office in the cold November wind for a moment after he had gone. She was not going to cry on a public street. She went inside and mailed her letter to her father, a longer one than usual, containing more truth than the previous ones, telling him what had actually happened, telling him where she actually was, telling him she was staying for now and would explain more when she could, telling him she was all right in the specific way that meant I'm not all right yet, but I'm getting there and I know the difference. Silas came to town that afternoon, which he didn't usually do on a Thursday, and she thought she understood why when he appeared outside the post office precisely as she came out of it. Because Blackridge was small and the news was everywhere, and he had known her 6 weeks and he was a man who showed up. He looked at her the way he often did, thoroughly, without being obvious about it, and said, "How are you doing?" "I've been better," she said. "I've also been worse." She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "Clara Whitmore gave me a very significant look at the general store this morning." Clara Whitmore gives everyone significant looks. It's essentially her occupation. She's not wrong to this time. Eleanor looked down the street toward the train station at the end of it. The bench on the platform was visible from here. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away. "People keep telling me I have nothing to be ashamed of." "You don't." "I know that, intellectually." She paused. Knowing it and feeling it are on a slight delay. He nodded. He understood delays between knowing and feeling. She had the sense that he was intimately familiar with this particular terrain. "The attorneys in Billings will want to talk to me," she said. "I've been thinking about whether I'll go." "Do you want to?" She turned the question over. She had been turning it over since the moment she read that letter in the office. There was a version of her that wanted to go, wanted to put her name on a formal document, wanted to stand in a room and say what had been done, wanted to be part of the mechanism that stopped Caleb Mercer from doing it to anyone else. She believed in that version of herself. She respected her. There was also a version of her that recognized something else, that a trial or even a deposition would require her to be, publicly and formally, the woman who had been deceived, that it would travel, the name, the story, the specifics, that her father would read about it in the Boston papers possibly, that she would be defined in the official record by the worst thing that had happened to her, and not by how she had handled it afterward. "I don't want him to do this to anyone else," she said. "I know. But She stopped. "You don't have to decide today," Silas said. "No." She looked at him. He was standing slightly into the wind, the way people who spend most of their time outdoors do. Not fighting it, just accommodating it without thinking about it. "If I went, would you—" She stopped again. She was not entirely sure what she was asking. He didn't make her finish. "Yes," he said. "If you wanted that." She nodded. Something settled slightly. Not the decision itself, which she hadn't made, but the shape of what was available to her, which was larger than it had been. "I need to think," she said. "Take the time." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had come to a train platform at night with a lantern, who had given her work and morning coffee, and the honest information that he didn't know how to tell her things. Who had not pushed, who had not made her situation into something she owed him for navigating, who had simply stood beside whatever was happening and let her navigate it herself. "I'm not going to let him define me," she said. The words arrived already certain, the way things sometimes do when you've been thinking around them for long enough that the thinking finally arrives at its own conclusion. "Caleb Mercer. I'm not going to spend the rest of my time out here being the woman who was fooled by him, or spend any time at all being that, if I can manage it." Silas held her gaze. "No reason you should. I'm going to talk to the attorneys. I'm going to give them what I have. The letters, my account of what happened, all of it." She paused. "And then I'm going to be done with it. I'm going to give them what they need, and I'm going to walk out of that office, and I'm going to stop carrying it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the harder thing, walking out." "I know." She looked at the train station again, at the bench at the end of the platform. 6 weeks ago, she had sat on that bench in the dark and understood herself as a woman abandoned at the edge of the world with $31 and no plan. The bench hadn't changed. The platform hadn't changed. But she was not the same woman who had sat on it. "I'm going to be all right," she said. Not to him exactly. Or not only to him. More like a statement made to the air, to the street, to Blackridge as a whole, for whatever it was worth. Silas looked at her with an expression that had moved past the careful neutrality he usually maintained and into something that was harder to categorize. Something that had been gathering for 6 weeks in the silences and the coffee and the cold beans and the evenings when she drove home in the dark while he stood in the doorway of his house and watched her go. "I believe that," he said. It came out simply, with the particular quality of something said without planning, without awareness of how it might sound, the truth of it preceding any consideration of whether to offer it. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved down Blackridge's main street in the flat, steady manner of a Montana wind that has a great deal of territory to cover and is not particularly interested in anyone's schedule. Neither of them said anything else. There was something in the air between them that had not been there before, or had been there and had been unnamed and was now slightly less unnamed, which was not the same as being acknowledged, but was closer to it. Like a ledger that has been corrected but not yet signed. The numbers are right. Someone still needs to confirm them. Eleanor looked away first. She pulled her coat tighter. "I should get back," she said. "I'll bring the wagon around." He walked toward the livery, and she stood on the street in front of the post office with her hands in her pockets, watching the way the light fell flat and white across the town. And she thought, whatever this is, whatever is happening here, it is mine. I built it out of the worst 6 weeks of my life, and it is mine. And no one is going to take it from me. She was sure of that in the way she was rarely sure of things that mattered. She heard the wagon coming and she turned toward it and walked. She went to Billings on a Thursday in early December, 3 weeks after she'd made the decision on Blackridge's main street. Silas drove her to the station without being asked, which she had expected by now. The way she had come to expect the coffee and the dinner and the wordless accompaniments that had become the texture of working alongside him. He waited with the wagon while she boarded. She did not look back at the platform as the train pulled out, because she had looked at that platform enough times from enough different angles, and she was finished letting it be a place that held power over her. The attorney's office was on a respectable street in Billings, on the second floor of a building that smelled of paper and old wood. James Crow was a slight man in his 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the precise manner of someone who has spent his career listening to things people find difficult to say. He was kind without being soft about it, which Eleanor appreciated. He did not treat her like a victim who needed managing. He treated her like a witness, which was what she was, and that distinction mattered more than she had anticipated. She gave him the letters, all 14 of them, which she had carried out of Boston in a leather portfolio her father had given her, and which she set on his desk with the particular finality of setting something down for the last time. Crow looked at them without touching them immediately. "You're certain you want to surrender these?" "They're evidence," she said. "That's what they are now." He looked at her over his spectacles with something like respect. "There are 5 other women," he said. 2 have agreed to provide statements. 2 are unwilling to be named publicly, which I understand. 1 is still deciding." He paused. "Your account and these letters constitute the strongest documentary evidence we have. Mercer is denying everything, as expected. He has a lawyer." "Of course he does." "It will take time. These things always do." "I understand." She folded her hands on her lap. "I want to be clear about something, Mr. Crow. I'm giving you this because it's the right thing to do and because I don't want him to do it to anyone else. But I'm not going to build my life around waiting for his verdict. Whatever happens in a courtroom in Billings is not the center of my story." Crow looked at her for a long moment. "That's a wiser position than most people manage," he said. She gave her statement. It took 2 hours and was thorough and unpleasant, in the particular way that honest accounting of a humiliation is always unpleasant, and she got through it by treating it the way she treated difficult ledgers, one entry at a time, without letting the overall picture overwhelm the present task. When it was done, she signed the document and shook Crow's hand and walked out of the office and down the stairs and out onto the Billings street. The cold hit her face. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. She had expected to feel lighter. She felt tired instead, which was perhaps more honest, the kind of tired that follows something completed rather than something lost, which is a different quality of tired if you pay attention to it. She found a restaurant 2 streets over and sat alone at a table by the window and ordered coffee and a sandwich. She mostly ate, and she looked at the street outside and she thought about Blackridge. She thought about the office with the stove that had opinions about wind direction. She thought about the ledgers, which were now in a state she was genuinely proud of. Organized, reconciled, useful. She thought about Pete's cooking, which she had never told him was adequate because she enjoyed his continued effort to impress her. She thought about Ruth Henderson, who had never once offered pity when what she actually meant was respect, and Tom Reardon, who had planted himself in her path on the street and declared himself on her side with the matter-of-fact conviction of a man who has daughters. She thought about morning coffee on the desk. She thought about Silas standing in the doorway of his house in the evening light, watching her drive back to town. She paid for her lunch and walked back to the station and took the afternoon train home to Blackridge, which was the word her mind had used, home, without consulting her, and she let it stand. December settled over the ranch with the particular severity of a Montana winter that has decided to make itself known. The temperature on some mornings dropped low enough that the windows in the office grew a fine film of ice on the inside, which Eleanor scraped off with a card she kept for the purpose, and which Silas had noticed and said nothing about. And then one day there was a second layer of insulation tacked to the wall behind her desk, and she said nothing about that either. The work had shifted in character. The ledgers were caught up through the end of November, which meant she was no longer excavating but maintaining, a different, lighter kind of attention. She had begun making projections, which was work she hadn't suggested and hadn't been asked to do but had started doing because the data was there and the questions were obvious, and she had the kind of mind that sees a question it can answer and cannot comfortably ignore it. She put the first projection on his desk with her weekly summary in early December. He read it and came to find her in the office. "You're saying we should sell the North Pasture cattle before February?" The feed costs through winter against current prices. Yes, you'll take a smaller return, but you'll avoid the carrying costs through the cold months. And based on last year's patterns, the prices won't recover enough in spring to make the difference worth it. He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed, looking at the projection page. He had the expression of a man who is weighing something he didn't expect to be weighing. Fowler never did this kind of work. Fowler was keeping accounts. I'm trying to help you plan. There's a difference. A significant one, yes. He looked at her then, not at the page. Why? He said. She met his eyes. Because it's useful. Because you've given me honest work, and I prefer to return that in kind. She paused. And because this ranch deserves to be doing better than it is, and the numbers show a clear path, and it bothers me not to say so, something moved across his face that she'd seen before. That particular quality of attention that was more than professional and less than anything either of them had named. He looked back at the page. I'll think about the north pasture, he said. That's all I'm asking. He thought about it for 2 days and then sold the north pasture cattle, and the margin she'd projected was accurate to within $4, which was a better outcome than she'd expected from her own estimates. He did not tell her she'd been right. He put $20 on her desk on Friday with her pay and said, bonus, in the tone of a man who is not going to elaborate, and walked out. She looked at the $20 for a moment. Then she put it in her purse and went back to work, and did not let him see her smile because he was already insufficiently aware of how much she noticed things, and she preferred to keep it that way. The days shortened further. The cold deepened, and something between them deepened alongside it in the same gradual, unproclaimed way. Not an event, but an accumulation. The way rivers change course not through drama, but through the patient persistence of water against whatever is in its path. He had begun talking more, not dramatically more. It would not have been accurate to call Silas Granger a talkative man in any season, but more than the baseline. Over dinner, he would mention something that had happened in the morning, a problem with the fence line, or an incident involving Bonaparte in a bucket he'd apparently taken personal offense to, and she would respond, and there would be a conversation rather than a silence, and neither of them treated this as an event worth remarking on, which was perhaps why it continued to happen. She stayed later in the evenings more often, partly because the work warranted it, which was true, partly because the 4-mile drive back to town in the December dark was genuinely unpleasant, which was also true, and partly because of a third reason she did not examine directly, but which had something to do with the fact that the office at the ranch was a place where she felt like herself. Not the woman who had arrived abandoned on a platform, not the woman whose story Blackridge knew, not the woman being carefully respected by neighbors who were maintaining a particular kind of consideration on her behalf. Just herself. Eleanor Hayes, who was good at numbers and occasionally funny and did not always eat when she should. She was at her desk on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of December when she heard Silas in the main room. The particular sound of someone moving around who is not entirely sure what to do with himself. She had come to recognize this sound over the past weeks, and it usually preceded him appearing in the office doorway with a question he'd been working up to. She waited. He appeared in the doorway. She looked up. He was not wearing his hat, which he usually removed when he came inside, but which she'd noticed he sometimes put back on when he was uncomfortable, as though it gave him something to do with his hands. He did not have it now. His hands were at his sides with the specific stillness of hands that are not sure where to be. I need to say something, he said. All right, she said. He came in and sat down in the chair across from her desk, the chair where she occasionally put stacks of files and which he had apparently decided he was going to sit in regardless. He looked at the desk surface for a moment, then at her. I'm not good at this, he said. At what? Saying things. He looked at the desk again. I think in straight lines. I know what I mean, but getting it from where it is to where it needs to be. He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly with the expression of a man fighting his own inadequacy with something. I've been practicing, he said. In my head. All week. It came out better in my head. Eleanor set down her pen. She gave him her full attention, which he had, she realized, always given her, thoroughly and without performance, and she thought it was the least she could offer in return. Take your time, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the house. The stove ticked. When you came here, he said, you were you were in bad shape, not visibly. You held yourself together better than most people could have. But I could see it. He looked at his hands. I thought you'd leave. Inside of a month, I thought you'd get your feet under you and go back east where things made sense to you. And I thought that was probably right, that you should go back. But I didn't. No. Something in his voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but with less resistance in it. You stayed, and you fixed my books, and you told me things about my own operation I didn't know, and you... He stopped again. You made the place different. I come in the mornings and it's different than it was before. It's not a thing I can point to exactly. It's just... He shook his head slightly. Different. Eleanor looked at him across the desk. She was not going to help him, she had decided. Not because she was unkind, but because whatever he was working toward needed to arrive in his own words, at his own pace, without her pulling it forward. She understood the importance of that. I'm not good at this, he said again. You mentioned that. He looked at her. Something in his expression crossed from difficult into almost rueful. I'm not going to stand here and tell you beautiful things, he said. I don't have them. That's not who I am. He paused. I know you came out here because someone made you promises. I know what those promises cost you. I'm not going to make promises like that. What are you going to make? She said quietly. An offer. He held her gaze steadily, with the same quality of attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. Thorough, unhurried, real. Stay. Not for the books. Though I need you for the books, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. A pause. Stay as my wife, as my partner in this place. Equal say in decisions, equal standing. I mean that, and I'll put it in writing if you want it in writing. She looked at him. It's not a big offer, he said. The ranch isn't much. The town is small. The winters are... He glanced at the window where the dark pressed against the glass. You know what the winters are. I've gathered. I'm not an easy person. He said it with the particular frankness of someone who has made peace with a truth they've verified many times. I'm quiet when I should probably talk, and I get fixed on things, and I don't always know what I'm feeling until it's been around for a while. A pause. But I mean what I say. Every word. And I don't say words I don't mean. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at this man, at his rough coat and his honest face, and the hands that were still not quite sure where to be. And she thought about all the things she knew about him that he hadn't told her. The barn roof replaced before it was strictly necessary, the horse that was going to be put down, the lantern held at his side on a dark platform, at a careful, respectful distance, asking only the questions that needed asking. The letter about Caleb Mercer received and held and never used as a claim on her gratitude. She thought about 14 letters from a man who had never existed, and she thought about 6 weeks of evidence from a man who had been in front of her every single day. She thought about what she had said on the street in November. I'm not going to let him define me. And she recognized that the obverse of that was also true. She was not going to let the fact of having been deceived make her afraid of the real thing, when the real thing was plainly, quietly, sitting across a desk from her telling her he didn't have beautiful words, but he meant every word he had. I know you mean what you say, she said. That's not a small thing, Silas. That's not a small thing at all. He looked at her. The books need at least another quarter of consistent attention before I'd trust someone else with them, she said. His expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty, not sure where this was going. I'm telling you that so you understand what you're taking on, she continued. I have opinions. I have them constantly, and I share them whether they're requested or not. I will argue with your financial decisions, and I will usually be right, and you'll find that irritating approximately half the time. I already find it irritating half the time, he said. Yes, and you've managed. Something was happening to his expression. The resistance was going out of it, the careful held quality he usually maintained, and what was underneath was less defended and more real, and she found she could look at it without difficulty. I'm not the same woman who got off that train, she said, and I'm not going to pretend what happened didn't happen or that it didn't change things. But I'm also... She paused, finding the exact words. I'm also the woman who drove herself home in the dark for 6 weeks and came back every morning. That's the woman who's answering you. He nodded, once, the nod of someone who understands exactly what is being said and accepts it completely. Yes, she said. The answer is yes. He let out a breath. She hadn't realized he'd been holding it, but he had, and the release of it was so human and unguarded that it did something to her chest that she filed away quietly to examine later. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They sat with it for a moment. The decision, which was enormous and had been made without any of the ceremony. Enormous decisions are supposed to require no candlelight, no carefully chosen setting, no rehearsed words, a desk covered in ledgers, a stove that ticked, a window full of December dark. It was exactly right. It was the most exactly right thing she had experienced in a very long time. The ring was my mother's, he said, after a moment. If you want it. If you don't, we can get something in town. Ruth Henderson's husband does some gold work, I think. I would like to see your mother's ring, Eleanor said. He nodded. He stood up from the chair and put his hands in his pockets. The gesture of a man who has finished saying a difficult thing and is not quite sure what comes next, which she recognized as one of his most characteristic postures, and which she found she did not mind at all. Stay for dinner, he said. Pete made something. It's probably not bad. Pete's cooking is considerably better than not bad, and he knows it. Don't tell him I agreed with you. I would never. She stood and gathered the papers she'd been working on and squared them against the desk with the habitual neatness that was simply part of her. Silas, he looked back from the doorway. I didn't come to Montana for this, she said. I want you to know I understand that. I came for something false, and I found something real, and those are very different things, and I don't want you to ever wonder whether you were a consolation. He was quiet for a moment. I know I'm not a consolation, Eleanor. Good. Do you? She held his gaze. Yes, she said. I do. He turned and walked toward the kitchen, and she followed, and outside the Montana winter pressed its full weight against the walls of the house, and inside the lamp burned steady, and somewhere in the corral Bonaparte had apparently made peace with the evening because there was no sound from the fence line, nothing but the wind and the dark and the particular silence of a place that has become, without announcement, without drama, without anything so neat as a plan, home. They married in February, which was not anyone's idea of a romantic month in Montana. The ceremony was small. Ruth Henderson's parlor, which was the warmest room available in Black Ridge in February, and also the largest room anyone was willing to heat to a socially acceptable temperature for a gathering. Ruth had put up some dried flowers she'd been saving, the exact species of which Eleanor couldn't identify, but which were yellow and slightly past their prime, and therefore, Eleanor thought, honest in the way all the best things had been honest in her life out here. Pete wore his good shirt, which appeared to be the same as his regular shirt, but cleaner and with fewer opinions about it. Tom Reardon came with his wife and two of his daughters. The man from the saddle shop stood in the back with his hat in his hands. The justice of the peace was a compact, serious man named Aldridge, who had apparently married a significant proportion of Blackridge's adults over the previous 15 years, and treated the proceedings with the professional gravity of someone who understands that some of the things people ask him to officiate are the most important things they will ever do. Silas wore a coat Eleanor hadn't seen before, which was dark and fit him properly, and she thought he must have had it made or altered recently, and she thought about him going to that trouble without mentioning it, which was so completely characteristic of the man she was about to marry that it made something ache in her chest in the specific way of things that are simply true. She wore the blue dress she'd arrived in, the practical one, the dark wool, because it was the best she had, and because she had come to feel that there was something appropriate about it. She had arrived in this dress. She was staying in this dress. That felt like the right kind of continuity. Arthur Hayes did not make it for the wedding. The distance was too great for February, and Eleanor had told him so when she wrote, honestly, not softening it, and he had written back a letter that was the longest he had ever sent her, covering 3 full pages in his careful pharmacy hand, and it contained everything he felt about her marrying a man he had never met in a territory he had never seen. The concern was there, real and parental, and something she absorbed with full respect. And at the end, in the same 2-word cadence he'd ended every letter with since October, except now the 2 words were different. Be happy. She folded that letter into the leather portfolio beside the legal receipt from Henderson and Crow confirming the surrender of Caleb Mercer's correspondence as evidence. She had kept both. She was not entirely sure why, except that she believed in keeping accurate records of things that had actually happened, especially when what had happened was difficult. Caleb Mercer was convicted in March on 4 counts of fraud. He received a sentence that the Billings paper described as appropriate and that Eleanor read about in a copy of the paper Ruth saved for her. She read the article once, folded the paper, and handed it back to Ruth. "Satisfied?" Ruth asked. Eleanor thought about it honestly. "Not satisfied," she said, "but finished with it. Those are different." Ruth nodded with the expression of someone who understands the distinction and respects the person who makes it. Spring came late that year, which Pete had predicted in November with the same minimal elaboration he applied to all his predictions, and when it arrived with the particular extravagance of a Montana spring. Everything at once, the ground thawing and the grasses coming up, and the mountains shedding their snow in long, visible streaks, and the light returning in increments that felt almost aggressive after the months of flat white sky. Eleanor moved her things from Henderson's hotel to the ranch in March. It was not a complex operation. She had fewer possessions than she'd arrived with, having been deliberate about what she kept during the winter, shedding things that didn't belong to the life she was actually living. The leather portfolio came. Her father's letters came. The books she'd had shipped from Boston in November, which Ruth had stored in the hotel basement, came. The practical things came. Her good wool coat, her notebooks, the card she used for scraping ice off the inside of the office window. Silas had cleared out the larger bedroom upstairs and put a second lamp in it and a bookshelf he had built himself, which was not elegant and was extremely sturdy and held her books without complaint. She did not tell him it was one of the finest things anyone had done for her. She ran her hand along the shelf and said, "The spacing on the second shelf is slightly off." And he looked at her with an expression of mock severity and said, "Then don't put your bigger books there." And she smiled and put her bigger books there specifically, and that was that. She began a kitchen garden in April on the south side of the house, which was her own idea and which Silas had opinions about in terms of placement, but not in terms of principle. He helped her turn the soil on a Saturday morning without being asked, working beside her in the particular companionable way they had developed for physical tasks, which was side by side without constant commentary. Both of them understanding that presence is its own form of communication and doesn't always need words attached. "Your father grow things?" he asked at one point when they were both on their knees in the dirt. "No, he had no feeling for it." She turned a clod of earth. "My mother did, apparently. I never knew her well enough to ask." He was quiet for a moment. "How old were you?" 12. "She was sick for a year before. I knew she was going to die, but 12 is old enough to know it and young enough to not believe it." She sat back on her heels and looked at the turned earth. "My father never really recovered. He managed. He was always good at managing, but something compressed in him after. He got quieter." "You got competent," Silas said. Not harshly, just observationally, the way he said things he'd worked out to be true. She looked at him. "Is that your diagnosis? Woman raises herself after her mother dies, takes over her father's accounts, runs everything quietly so he doesn't have to carry it alone." He shrugged slightly. The Silas Granger shrug, which meant this is simply what I see, and I'm not going to apologize for seeing it. "You got very good at holding things together. Hard to let anything be held for you after that." She sat with that for a moment. It was accurate in the way that things said plainly by someone who has been paying attention are accurate. Not comfortable, but undeniable. "Your mother?" she said. "Gone 12 years. He turned another section of earth. She held things together too, after my father had his episodes." A pause. "He drank. Not always, but enough." He looked at the ground. "She kept the ranch going those years. I watched her do it. I think that's why He stopped. "Why you what?" "Why I recognize it," he said, "in other people, the ones who've been doing the holding." She looked at him kneeling in the dirt in the April sun, this man who had built her a bookshelf and bought a horse no one else wanted, and stood on a dark platform with a lantern at a careful distance. And she understood something she had been understanding in pieces for months, that his quietness was not absence. It was the opposite of absence. It was the fullness of a man who had learned that the most important things don't always announce themselves. "You're better at saying things than you told me," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Don't spread it around. I have a reputation." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the turned earth and the open yard and the spring sky above the Granger Ranch, which was her ranch now too, and she did not feel the need to qualify that or hold it at arm's length, or be careful about how much she believed it. The first summer was not easy. Eleanor had not expected easy and would not have trusted it if it had arrived. The ranch work was relentless in summer, in a way the winter's indoor confinement had not prepared her for. The irrigation, the cattle movement, the equipment that broke at inconvenient times with the cheerful consistency of equipment that has been waiting for the busiest possible moment to fail. Pete injured his shoulder in July and was half useful for 6 weeks, which redistributed the physical labor in ways that fell partly on Eleanor because she refused to be the person who stayed inside while other people absorbed the extra load. Silas did not tell her she didn't have to help. He also did not tell her to be careful. He showed her what needed doing and how to do it, and trusted her to manage her own limits, which was the right call and which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated either of the alternatives. She ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. She also understood the land differently afterward, not from the outside the way she'd understood it when she first arrived, watching it through a train window with the distance of a person who has read about something and not yet lived in it, but from the inside, from the ground level, from the particular intimacy of a person who has worked in it in the summer heat and the mud of early thaw and the cold mornings when everything requires effort. Her letters to her father grew longer, more detailed. She described the garden, which was producing abundantly and unevenly, the way first gardens do. She described Bonaparte, who had in the spring made an unexpected social accommodation with a young mare named Frances, and was now only difficult about specific things rather than everything in general, which Pete considered a significant character development. She described the view from the kitchen window in the morning, the east-facing window, which she had thought about since before she had ever seen it, since a letter she now no longer had told her the light was something, and she tried, in words, to give her father what she could not give him in person yet. Arthur Hayes came in September. He arrived on the 4:15 train from Billings, which was the same train Eleanor had arrived on 11 months before, and she was standing on the platform when he stepped down, not because she was obligated to meet him there, but because she wanted him to have the experience of arriving and finding someone waiting. That mattered to her in a way she didn't need to explain to him. He was thinner than she remembered, which worried her. He was also somehow more himself, the posture of a man who has released something he was carrying too long, which she thought the letter he'd written in December might have had something to do with. He saw her and stopped on the platform steps and looked at her for a moment with the expression of a parent who is tallying the evidence of a life lived without them. What's different? What's the same? What it adds up to. She walked up and hugged him properly, not the brief contact they usually managed, but the real thing, and he returned it with the awkward, wholehearted intensity of a man who does not know what to do with his arms and is committed to the effort anyway. "You look different," he said, into her hair. "I've been digging," she said. "It does things to a person." He pulled back and looked at her face. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like a finding, the conclusion of an assessment he'd been running from 3,000 miles away for 11 months. "Yes," she said. "I really am." Silas was at the wagon. He and Arthur Hayes looked at each other on the platform in the way of men who have been briefed on each other through correspondence and are now engaged in the first real test of whether the correspondence was accurate. Arthur Hayes was 58 and precise, and carried his intelligence in the specific way of men who have spent their lives inside their own heads more than in their bodies. Silas was the opposite of that in nearly every measurable characteristic. They shook hands. Silas said, "Thank you for coming out." Arthur said, "She gave me no choice," and looked at Eleanor with the dry affection of a father who has understood finally that his daughter is not returning the way she left. "She does that," Silas said, putting the bags in the wagon. "Doesn't give people much choice." Eleanor climbed up to the wagon seat and said, "I'm sitting right here." "We know," said both men, and something, a small thing, but real, passed between them, and she sat back and drove them home. Her father stayed 2 weeks. He slept in the room Eleanor had set up with the second lamp, the one Silas had used for storage before she arrived, which was now clean and decent and had one of her books on the side table because she'd wanted it to feel like a room where a person was expected. The two men found their way to each other in the careful, incremental manner of two people who love the same woman and are negotiating what that means. Her father walked the ranch with Silas on the second morning, the two of them out among the fence lines for 2 hours, while Eleanor finished the quarterly projections she'd been working on and did not look out the window more than 4 times to check whether they were still upright. They came back. Her father sat at the kitchen table and Silas made coffee, and Eleanor put the projections away and came in and sat down, and the three of them had a conversation that was ordinary in its surface: the ranch, the cattle prices, the questions her father had about winter preparation, and extraordinary in its undercurrent, which was a father understanding a man his daughter had chosen and arriving, in real time, at a verdict. The verdict, she gathered, was positive. Not uncomplicated. Her father was not a man who arrived at simple verdicts about complex things, but positive. The morning before he left, she found him at the kitchen window, the east-facing one. He was standing with his coffee cup, looking out at the mountains, which were catching the early light in the way they did at this hour, turning from gray to gold in a gradient that happened slowly and then all at once, the way things that have been building always arrive. She stood beside him. "It's different here," he said. "Yes. The sky is—" He stopped. He was a precise man who rarely ran into the edges of his own vocabulary. "There's so much of it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "When you first wrote and told me what had happened, what that man did—" He stopped again. She could feel him managing something. "I should have come immediately." "You offered. I said not to." "I should have come anyway." She looked at his profile, the familiar lines of it, older than she always expected when she looked directly at him, the white of his hair. "I needed to handle it myself," she said. "I think you knew that." "I knew it, and I hated it simultaneously." He took a drink of his coffee. "Those are not mutually exclusive." "No, they're not." She leaned slightly against his shoulder the way she had when she was young and the world was smaller. "He's a good man, Papa. I can see that." He paused. "He's very quiet." "He talks more than he used to." Her father made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but acknowledged it. "He looks at you the way a man looks at something he's afraid of losing," he said. "I know that look. I wore it for 12 years. She did not say anything for a moment. The mountains were fully gold now, the shadow line retreating up their flanks as the sun came up behind the ranch. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded. He put his arm around her shoulders briefly, the gesture of a man who has spent 23 years being careful with his love, because he was afraid of what losing it would do to him, and who is, possibly, beginning to understand that the caring is worth the risk. The years that came after were not a string of perfect seasons. Eleanor would have been suspicious of perfect seasons, and Blackridge did not offer them anyway because Blackridge was a real place full of real conditions and real people and real weather, which is to say it was difficult and honest and occasionally magnificent. There were bad cattle years. There was a summer when the creek ran low and the garden failed and they ate from stores while watching the sky for rain that came late and insufficient. There was a winter when Silas's shoulder gave out, an old injury that had been building its case for years, and he was limited in his work for 3 months, which made him short-tempered and withdrawn in the specific way of a man unaccustomed to physical limitation. And Eleanor was not always patient about this, and they had arguments that were real arguments with raised voices and doors not quite slammed but firmly shut, and they got through them the way they got through everything, which was by being more committed to the truth of each other than to being right in any individual moment. Bonaparte died in the 5th year, in the early spring, which hit Silas harder than he showed, and which Eleanor knew because she had been paying attention to him for 5 years. She did not make a production of understanding it. She simply, for the week after, made sure he had coffee without being asked, as he had once done for her, and she did not offer comfort that would have required him to receive it in front of anyone. And she was there in the evenings, which was its own kind of comfort, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you. They had 2 children. A girl first, Anna, who arrived with the cooperative timing of a person who has decided to cause the minimum necessary inconvenience, and who grew into a child with her mother's precision and her father's silences and her own complete set of opinions about everything. A boy 3 years later, James, after her father, whose name had been Arthur James, and who died the year before James was born, peacefully, in the pharmacy on Tremont Street, which was where he had lived his whole careful life, and which Eleanor thought, privately, was the right place for him. She cried for her father in the office, alone, the day she got the letter. She sat at her desk, the same desk where she had excavated Silas's disorganized ledgers in the first winter, and she allowed herself to grieve fully, which she had learned over the years was the only way to grieve that actually worked. Silas found her there and sat in the chair across from her and said nothing, which was exactly right. The Black Ridge community changed around them in the way communities change. Some people left, new people came. The town got a second general store and then lost one and ended up more or less where it started. The Henderson Hotel changed hands when Ruth's health declined, and Eleanor managed Ruth's accounts through the transition with the same care she would have given her own. And when Ruth died in the 8th year, Eleanor sat in the front row at the service and thought about a woman who had put cold ham on a plate without comment for a stranger in the worst night of her life, and thought that was one of the most decent things a person could do, and that decency of that particular kind did not always get recognized the way it should. The ranch grew, not dramatically, not through some stroke of luck or expansion that changed the essential character of the place, but steadily. The way Silas did everything, the way Eleanor ran accounts, the way things grow when they are properly tended and honestly managed. They added land in the 3rd year, a section adjacent to the north pasture that came up for sale when the Wheelers moved on. They built a second barn in the 6th year, which Pete supervised with the authority of a man who has been doing something long enough to have valid opinions about it, and was relieved that someone was finally asking for them. She was at the kitchen window on a morning in the 12th year, October. The mountains already white to the tree line, the sky doing its impossible thing with the early light. When she understood something she had not had the distance to understand before. She had come to Montana for a false promise and found a real life. That was the simple version. But the simple version missed something important, which was that the real life had not simply been waiting for her like a compensation prize for getting the first thing wrong. She had built it. Out of the ruins of a decision that had made her feel foolish and small and abandoned, she had built something that was entirely her own. Not just hers and Silas's, but specifically hers, in the sense that her particular stubbornness and her particular skills and her particular refusal to be defined by what had been done to her had been the necessary ingredients. No one had rescued her. Silas had offered shelter and honest work, and eventually himself. But Eleanor Hayes, Granger now for 12 years, had done the work. She had made the choice to stay when staying was hard. She had made the choice to give the letters to the attorneys and walk out of that office and be finished with it. She had made the choice, standing in a cold office across a desk covered in ledgers, to recognize the real thing when it was in front of her. She heard Silas's boots on the stairs. She heard Anna's voice from somewhere outside. She was 11 and had recently taken to conducting elaborate negotiations with the horses in the corral, which the horses largely ignored and which she considered a matter of ongoing work. She heard James, 8 years old, asking Pete something that Pete was answering in his minimal, sufficient way, the way he had been answering people for as long as Eleanor had known him. Silas came into the kitchen. He looked at her standing at the window and said, "You're thinking," in the tone of a man who has spent 12 years learning to read the particular quality of her stillness. "I do that," she said. "What about?" She turned from the window. He was in his work clothes, holding his hat, about to go out for the morning. He was 47, and his face had the weathered quality of the land he worked, which was not a poetic observation, but simply true. He had a new line between his brows that had appeared sometime in the past year. His hands were the same. "About how things turn out," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that thorough, unhurried attention that had never changed in 12 years, the look of a man who believes that the person in front of him is worth looking at carefully. "Generally or specifically?" he said. "Specifically." She crossed the kitchen toward him. "A woman came to Blackridge once on the 4:15 train," she said, "and nobody was waiting for her, and she thought that was the end of something. And she was wrong." Eleanor looked at him. "It was the beginning." He held her gaze. Something moved across his face, not a smile exactly, though it was in that neighborhood. The expression of a man who has more feeling than language, and has made a kind of peace with that and found, over time, that certain people understand him anyway. She turned out all right, he said. She turned out fine, Eleanor said. Eventually, outside, Anna's negotiations with the horses had apparently reached an impasse. James was laughing at something Pete had said, which meant Pete had made a joke, which happened perhaps twice a year and was always worth noting. The sky to the east was doing what it always did at this hour, going from gold to bright, the light spreading across the land with the democratic generosity of a thing that has no preferences, that falls on the good and the struggling alike, that has been rising every morning before anyone was here to see it and will continue to do so long after. Eleanor Hayes Granger had stopped marking mornings as better or worse than what came before them. She had stopped comparing the life she had to the life she had once imagined. The comparison was not useful, and she was a practical woman. She had instead the thing itself, which was imperfect and seasonal and sometimes exhausting and real in every particular, and which was hers in the only way anything is truly anyone's, not because it had been given to her, but because she had stayed for it, and worked for it, and chosen it on an ordinary December evening across a desk covered in ledgers, and every morning since. That was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was everything.